Gamokum sat down beside Tule Lake. Seeing that nothing existed anywhere but water, he wondered how it would look if it had some land around it. So he reached down to the bottom of Tule Lake and drew up a handful of mud. He piled it up in front of him like a hill and patted it down with the palm of his hand. Soon the land began to spread until Tule Lake was completely surrounded by earth. Gamokum was left sitting on a little island of mud in the middle of the water.
According to our sacred narratives, the spirit Gamokum made this land in preparation for bringing the Muckluks into the world. This mountain today, called Peninsula, sits on the southeast corner of Tule Lake and is regarded as a spiritual center of the Muckluks world.
Creation stories are so vital to us, not only as a symbol of our identity, but also because it contains medicine. Gamokum created special places in our homeland to help guide us back to ourselves. In today's world, we find more often than not that the paths to wellness are continually leading us back to our origins. He made the earth with a sense of our identity, and more importantly, with our well-being in mind. To that end, he created a landscape that was so imbued with spirit power. And some of this spirit power, known to our ancestors, came in the form of beautiful art, in pictographs and petroglyphs. Depicting the spiritual world through rock art was once a vibrant and integrated part of our healthcare. It was medicine for the people and often served to protect the community from dangerous spirits. We are not able to pass by them with the same deep understanding that we once did. While we regard them as being sacred, they have lost much of their significance because we no longer connect to them in the same ways as our ancestors.
According to some, however, much information about these symbols can be found in our sacred narratives, or what Westerners would call our myths. We're going to take you on a journey back to our origins in search of this medicine.
When he finished all of his labors, Gamokum became very weary. With winter approaching, he decided to be like a bear and dig himself a hole below his mountain where he could sleep the winter through.
That's why we believe today that Camus still sleeps under the peninsula. And consequently, that's also why our ancestors went to the peninsula to seek out his power.
During this period, right after the world's creation, but before the coming of the Muckluks, the world was filled with powerful mythological beings. These beings were similar to the animals and people that exist in the world today, with the notable difference that they all possess great supernatural powers, and that animals and people talked alike.
Some of the beings described in the myths include Basadiwas, which were the mythological people, Skell, who was the ancient old pine marten, Tchaikovsky, the weasel, Old Man Mucus, who was the great horned owl, Shkoks, who could take on many forms, but was usually a skeletal figure, Wawiligus, the monarch butterfly, and Kies, the rattlesnake.
This proto-world operated according to a very different set of rules than we are accustomed to today. All of these mythological beings could fly, they could read minds, foretell the future, live underwater, and they can heal themselves by using the power of the sun, moon, and earth. They could even use these powers to return from the dead.
This was a period when time as we know it did not exist. Mythological time is similar to what others might call oblivion, since it followed no temporal trajectory. And like many other native groups, we call this time immemorial, since it extends far back beyond any human memory.
Life among these supernatural beings was similar to our lives today. They loved, they feuded, they gambled, ran races, climbed mountains, and foraged for food. Some of the tales even talk about them playing music on flutes, singing beautiful songs, and even decorating their bodies and wardrobe with beads, shell ornaments, and paint. For a time that cannot be measured, life proceeded in this fashion. But at some point, these mythological beings started talking about the arrival of the new people. Two stories in particular, Snake's story and Kamush's wanderings, tells how all of the world's inhabitants started to migrate toward the peninsula in order to hold a great council in which they would prepare the world for the new arrivals, by which they meant the Mukluks.
Animals, birds, and insects all knew that they would soon transition into physical, mortal beings, and they deliberated among themselves about what the world of real people would be like after they changed. They talked about the length of the year, the length of winter, and whether or not new people should live forever or should die, so that the world would not be overpopulated.
Representatives from all of the animal kingdom took part in this great council. Among those that are mentioned are long snake, fox, butterfly, bumblebee, owl, bear, and bull snake. Soon after the council ended, the mythological period came to an end, and all of these supernatural beings became ordinary animals. But their spirits lived on and went to their homes in the mountains. Having thus created conditions for their existence, Kmukumps knew it was time to bring Mukluks into this world. It is not known how long after the Great Council adjourned that the Mukluks arrived. Like the anticipated council itself, the arrival of the first people shows up in multiple tales, often couched within the trajectory of other stories. One version has it that Kmukumps created people out of the same clay he used to create the first land. Another version says he created people from hairs he plucked from his armpit. Still, another version, the one we tell here, derives from the story Kmukumps and his daughter.
Now Kmukumps had a daughter whom he loved very much. They lived together in his lodge at Nalakshi. Because she did not have a mother, Kmukumps was responsible for making her 10 beautiful dresses, one to commemorate each phase of her life. The 10th and final dress was her burial dress. One day, while she was still quite young, Kmukumps' daughter asked for her 10th dress. Kmukumps cried and refused to give it to her. But she knew her time had come and eventually persuaded Kmukumps to give it to her. The moment she put it on, she became a spirit and started her journey toward the spirit land in the west. Grieving and wanting to save her, Kmukumps left his body behind and followed his daughter. Following the path of the setting sun, they passed by other people, mountains, lakes, and wild rose bushes, and soon they reached the edge of the world. When they reached the spirit land, they found themselves in an enormous lodge built over a vast sunlit prairie. The prairie was filled with so many spirits that they could not count them. During day, these spirits were nothing but dry, disjointed bones. But every night, they would take on flesh, build fires, and then dance around them till dawn. Knowing that the spirits would be angry because their father was not dead, Kmukumps' daughter hid him in a corner of the great lodge, hoping no one would find him. There, he stayed hidden for many days. But soon they discovered a secret, and they tried to kill him. This went on for 6 days, until finally, Kmukumps went to speak with his brother, Washkumish, who was a chief of all the spirits there. He told Washkumish that he wanted to take some of the spirit bones with him up to the earth so that it would no longer be empty. Washkumish thought about this and eventually agreed. So the next day, when all the spirits turned back into dry bones on the prairie, Gamokumsh grabbed those of his daughter and placed them in his bag. He also gathered the bones from every tribe in the spirit land. Then, with tremendous effort, he followed the path of the rising sun. The way was slippery and steep, and the spirit bones tried to kill him, for they did not want to go to the upper world. But Gamokumsh pressed on. As he neared the top of the slope, however, his pack strap broke, and all the spirit bones fell out and ran back down to the spirit land, shouting and whooping all the way. Determined to succeed, Gamokumsh went back down after them. 3 times the spirit bones got away from him in this manner, and 3 times Gamokumsh went back to retrieve them. Finally, with great determination, Gamokumsh reached down to the bottom of the slope and threw his bag up on the level ground and cried, "Makluksum Cox, Indian bones."
To the southwest, he created the Shasta. To the far south, he created the Achamawi. To the east, the Numu. To the north, he created the Uxikni. Farther to the north, he created the Warm Springers. To the west, Malala. And finally, he created the Modoc.
Thus, Gamokumsh created the Mukluks, each in their own homeland, but he was not yet satisfied. Gamokumsh worried that people might become sick, and he wanted to be sure they had the means to take care of themselves. So he placed medicine in the mountains so that his people would be well and thrive.
Here, in our homeland, nearly every mountain, prairie, pond, and stream contains power. Some places in particular were meant to help us stay healthy and well. Some of those include Yamsey Mountain, Pelican Butte, Mount Scott, Diamond Peak, and so many others. Gamokumsh really recognized the strength of traditional health and its purpose. He placed medicine in all of these places for his people, and throughout their lives, our ancestors visited these places to ask the spirits for their medicine. Rock art is a symbol of those visits.
But some medicine was too strong for the people to use.
These medicines were thought to be poisonous, since the magnitude of their powers could be fatal to the uninitiated. So for that reason, Gamokumsh created shamans who could actually channel these powers and use them on behalf of the community.
Gamokumsh said, "You must find some with power to save you. Sometimes you must find someone to go and ask the mountains. The one who goes to the mountains must ask to be made what they want. For instance, to be wise, or brave, or rich, or a doctor. On Saddle Mountain, doctors used to camp. And at Crater Lake, they used to say they got to the water and swam. And after swimming and camping and keeping awake all night, piling rocks and breaking up twigs and tying them together, they would sit down and sleep, and they would dream. And whatever they dreamed of, grizzly bear, black bear, wolf, coyote, skunk, or all kinds of birds, whatever they dreamed of became their medicine, and they doctored with it. And snakes, fishes, everything became their medicine."
If we take a look at the shaman's medicine spirits described by the ethnographers, we learn that these are the same spirits of the animals that were at that mythological council. Now, some of these spirits appear in the sacred incantations of our ancestors, or in other words, shaman's medicine songs. But we're not talking about natural physical animals. We're talking about spiritual animals, the same animals that were at that mythological council. And what this tells us is that those animals at the mythological council had become shamans' medicine spirits. As it so happens, we find these exact same spirits in Klamath Basin rock art.
So what this tells us is that Gumukamsh, he looked way into our future and realized that we would need medicines to help us through all aspects of life, through all the challenges that we were going to be facing. And this medicine to this day exists in nearly every single corner of our homeland.
Robert David is an archaeologist and rock art specialist who has spent the last 20 years researching Klamath Basin rock art.
Well, what drove me to focus on Klamath Basin rock art is that nobody in our community seemed to remember what it was all about. Back when I was doing my graduate studies, a lot of people knew where to send me to find rock art, but nobody could tell me what the symbols represented. Between the time that these sacred symbols were active in our community and today, something must have happened to make us forget. Well, if we look back to the beginning of the reservation period, we can see that our loss of this knowledge started there.
In the early days of the Klamath Indian Reservation, agency superintendents found the traditional political system of the Indians to be too cumbersome. In order to deal with them more efficiently, they wanted to install a political structure that closely matched its own. What this meant was the superintendents wanted the tribe to abandon their traditional leadership system, in which each village had a head man, and to elect a single leader that would speak for the whole tribe.
The only problem with this was that shamans often wielded enormous influence over the people. More influence, in fact, than our traditional leaders, the village headmen.
Often referred to as medicine men in old books and movies, shamans were ritual specialists who performed a variety of services for the tribal community. These services included things like curing the sick, controlling the weather, finding lost objects, and foretelling the future, all through the use of spirits. Because of their relationship with these spirits, shamans were both respected and feared. Because of their influence over the people, agency superintendents considered shamans to be a threat to the political system they wanted to install. Their answer was to outlaw shamanism and authorizing the chiefs to arrest and detain any caught practicing their craft, and to force them to return any fees they received for their services. Over time, fewer and fewer tribal members found that they could make a living by pursuing the life of a shaman, and by the early 20th century, only a few remained, and their influence had diminished considerably.
Now, what all this has to do with rock art is that among our ancestors, only shamans had made the rock art. Well, once their practice had been driven underground, our knowledge of the rock art faded, and today, over a century later, we've all but forgotten about it. But fortunately, that's not the end of the story.
What was ironic about the federal government's efforts to eradicate the traditional religion of the Muckluks is that they may well have been instrumental in actually preserving it. The belief that all Indian peoples would soon be either extinct or corrupted by white civilization ushered in the concept of salvage ethnography. All throughout the latter 19th and early 20th centuries, the federal government sponsored anthropological expeditions to collect all the information they could from Native American communities before it was too late. This included oral histories and myths.
Now, in the 1870s and 1880s, the Bureau of American Ethnology did a study on the Klamath and the Modoc. And the ethnologists that concern us here are Albert Gatchett and Jeremiah Curtin. Well, these ethnologists were interested in a Native American language, and their goal with our people was to gather enough information to create a Klamath English dictionary.
One method linguists used to collect native languages was to systematically record large bodies of mythic tales and oral histories. Then, with the help of bilingual tribal members, they would write the stories down in both languages, which they often needed to create special characters to capture native sounds. These written texts then served as a database from which they created dictionaries. In this way, Jeremiah Curtin, Albert Gatchett, and later Barker each collected numerous mythic tales of the Muckluks. As a new member of the Bureau of American Ethnology, Jeremiah Curtin and his wife, Alma, had traveled to the Quapaw Indian Territory in Oklahoma in 1884 to collect mythic tales from the Seneca Indians. But while there, they chanced upon the exiles from the Modoc War and became acquainted with Coalacca, an old woman from whom they collected a large volume of these mythic tales. From all accounts, the Curtins found Coalacca to be an extraordinary woman.
Though old and feeble, at the time she told the myths, she was remarkable for her intelligence and her wonderful memory. In childhood, her grandfather had instructed her in the religion of her people. In other words, taught her all the myths of the Modoc. And to old age, her tenacious memory retained many of them.
Later, in 1884, Mr. Curtin visited the Modoc who had remained on the Klamath Indian Reservation in order to field check the stories given to him by Coalacca and to collect others. There, old Chief Sconchin, by then retired, provided him with several others, along with a good deal of information about Modoc customs.
Though old and infirm, his mind was still clear and active. For years, in the prime of his life, he was chief of his people, and in his old age they revered him.
Following her husband's death in 1912, Alma Curtin published a book containing 60 Modoc myths. But the bulk of the materials they had collected, consisting of over 1,200 legal-sized pages written in longhand, were housed in the Library of American Anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution. There they sat for most of the 20th century. But in 1991, tribal members Gordon Bettles and Mary Gentry assisted in a joint project to organize and transcribe the unpublished Curtin and Gatchett material.
Now, what makes these sacred narratives so powerful is that for our ancestors, they form the foundation of all things spiritual. So in this regard, they provide just enormous insight into the nature of sacred objects and rock art. Let me offer an example. Say that in 10,000 years from now, the archaeologists of that time uncover a stained glass window from an old Gothic cathedral. Well, it's intact, and they dust it off and find that they see a picture of 12 or 13 people sitting at a table that appear to be having supper. These archaeologists have no idea what they're looking at. All they can tell is that there are 13 people sitting at a table, and one of them appears to be important as he has an emblem of the sun shining over his head, and he's the only one at the table with a fancy cup. Well, without an insider's perspective, the best they'll be able to do is to approach this phenomenon using formal archaeological methods. So, like statistical analysis. I mean, they could count the number of people sitting at the table and determine there are 13 people sitting at that table. But again, with the assistance of an informing literature, again, the Bible in this case, they'll have all the information they need to determine that they're actually looking at a picture of the Last Supper. That's precisely how our own sacred narratives are helping us to understand the rock art.
According to David's research, rock art images depict the powerful supernatural beings of myth. Through complex rituals and incantations, shamans would invoke these beings and use their powers to diagnose and treat illness, control the weather, foretell the future, and protect the village from the dangerous spirits.
Shamans were considered to be the servants of their medicines or their spirit helpers. That is, that their role was to channel these spirits so that the spirits could work through them to perform all these supernatural deeds. So, for example, when a shaman was trying to find a lost object, he or she would actually be channeling a spirit associated with supernatural vision. For example, Old Man Mokus, the owl spirit. And our ancestors would understand that it was the owl spirit who was looking for the object through the person of the shaman. The shaman was actually the vehicle for that spirit.
Understanding this concept can shed light on certain kinds of rock art imagery. For example, some images are made up of a combination of human and animal components. These images can be thought of as self-portraits of the shaman artists themselves as they appear in their full spirit capacity, possessed, as it were, by their spirit medicines.
We'll take this figure here from Petroglyph Point. Now, it appears to show a human-like figure with disproportionately long limbs and 3 digits on each of its hands and feet. Well, what animal in the animal kingdom might exhibit these features? Well, one of the primary medicines or medicine spirits that shamans kept in their lodges and that shows up in their medicine songs was the crane, the blue crane in particular. Because of its habit of patiently standing at the water's edge looking for its prey, the blue crane, by way of analogy, became a spirit that shamans would consult when they were searching for their medicines or their spirits roaming the landscape. So when a shaman was consulted to diagnose and cure a case of sickness in the village, one of the first medicines they would call upon was the spirit of the blue crane. Now, what we're seeing in this image here from Petroglyph Point then might be thought of as a shaman transmogrified by his medicine, the blue crane, and empowered by its spirit to find their medicines. Well, much of the rock art in our homeland then is related in some way to spiritual medicine. The shaman's curing procedure in particular offers us an excellent structure for understanding these symbols. And that's because the procedure involved the spirits they would need to both diagnose and treat illnesses caused by other spirits.
The first step in this procedure was the shaman's preparatory acts, in which they would smoke their pipes in a fashion directed by their spirits. This was thought to help them become more receptive to their spirit medicine. The second step was the diagnostic procedure, in which they called upon the spirits considered to be particularly useful in identifying the cause of the patient's sickness. The third and final step was the curing procedure itself.
Now, the diagnostic procedure took the most time. Now, the first spirit that was usually called was Wakitas, the frog spirit. And this was because the frog spirit was a keen analyst of food. So if a bad spirit had entered a person's body through eating or drinking, the spirit Wakitas could discover the culprit. Now, Lamash, or the lightning spirit, was also usually called, and that's because lightning illuminates even the night sky. So by way of analogy, shamans could tap into the illumination of Lamash to discover any culprit spirits that might be hiding nearby, causing sickness and disease. Now, if this spirit assembly did reach a diagnosis, then the shaman would proceed to the next stage, which of course was the cure, and for that they needed different spirits.
No matter which spirit brought about the sickness, the theory was always the same. The culprit spirit had placed an intrusive object or mass in the person's body, and it had to be removed. This was always removed by the same method, through ritual sucking. That is, through the person of the shaman, an appropriate spirit, usually some kind of bug, was called upon to suck out the intrusive matter out of the victim's body, where it could then be destroyed. This was thought to cure the patient.
Well, with this procedure in mind, what we should expect to see in the rock art are the spirits that shamans would have needed to both diagnose and cure cases of sickness and disease. Common symbols in Klamath Basin rock art is the sun disk. Now, according to our sacred narratives, the sun disk was the medicine of Kamoosh. And Kamoosh, in fact, was reported to be a great healer. All throughout our sacred narratives, we hear tales about how Kamoosh brought people back to life in a sweat lodge. So accordingly, when we see this sun disk in the rock art, we're seeing a tool used by shamans to bring people back to health.
When the cremation pile was burnt to ashes, there remained a bright disk about as large as the sun in heaven. Lakakawis asked one of her brothers to see what the bright thing was in the ashes. The one who killed him took up this disk, and they prepared to bury the ashes with all their valuable beads. The brothers gave her this disk and said, "Take it to Gmokumch at Nilaski, who raises people from the dead in the sweating house."
Skulks were considered to be dangerously powerful, but dangerous even to shamans. Okay, Skulks often appears in the Miz as a skeleton. Now, all throughout the Miz, we often see that Skulks help shamans to locate the souls of sick people who had left their host bodies and started wandering toward the land of the dead. Well, Skulks' screams were thought to have attracted those souls and brought them back to their host bodies, thus saving the patient's life. Well, certain bugs were also particularly powerful because of their analogous behavior with the ritual curing procedure. The wood tick, for example, bites its way into your body and then feeds off your blood, sucking your blood. Well, by way of analogy, shamans also bite their way into the patient's body and then ritually suck out the intrusive matter that's causing the sickness. So this made the wood tick particularly powerful medicine for achieving that task. Well, this symbol here from Painted Cave depicts not the milkweed bug itself, but its body patterns. So by way of analogy, you're seeing a depiction of the spirit of the milkweed bug. Now, why the milkweed bug? Well, because similar to the wood tick, it feeds by inserting its beak, its long tube-like beak, into its prey and ingesting digestive enzymes and then sucking out its nutrients. Well, this is analogous to the way that the shaman would suck out the intrusive matter causing the sickness in his or her patient. And hence this bug served as a supernatural medicine. Okay, finally, one of my favorite spirit medicines is the butterfly, as you can see from this wonderfully elaborate panel. Now, unfortunately, Gatchik never recorded her spirit song, but her importance to shamanic curing is told in the story Asis and Kamoosh.
Isis and Gmokumsh look alike. One day, Gamokumsh decided to steal Isis' wives. So he promised Isis that he would make him some arrows and send him to an eagle's nest on top of a small tree to collect some feathers. At Gamokumsh's will, the tree suddenly grew far into the sky, trapping Isis at its top. Then, Gamokumsh dressed in Isis' clothes, hoping to fool his wives. All of Isis' wives were deceived except for Wachaja, dog, Tachakis, wren, Kuls, groundhog, and Walwilligus, butterfly. While the other wives went to play games with Gamokumsh, Butterfly convinced the few faithful wives to find and care for Isis. Dog led them to the base of the tree where Isis was trapped. Groundhog tried, but failed to dig it up. Butterfly flew up the tree and discovered Isis was almost dead. All that remained of him was skin and bones. Back on the ground, she prepared a basket full of everything she would need to restore him to health, and then flew in circles back up to the tree, reaching Isis the next day. Using the things she had brought, Butterfly cared for Isis for all through the night, while Dog returned to their home to build him a sweat house. The next morning, Butterfly put Isis into the basket and flew him home. Once there, they put Isis in the sweat house to complete his recovery.
Now it's important to note that in these tales, spousal terms were used to denote a spirit helper or a medicine. So the references to Isis's wives then were a reference to his many medicines, of which Kamush was envious. Well, in this story, Kamush managed to trap Isis and steal the majority of his wives. However, it was the butterfly spirit that took the lead in tracking him down and restoring Isis to health. Well, that's exactly the role of a spirit helper, and incidentally why they're also called medicines. Now, if we examine this rock art panel here, it's not hard to see elements of the story depicted here. The most prominent figure, of course, is this beautifully engraved picture of a spirit butterfly. And to the right of this, we also see not one, but two engraved concentric circles connected by these zigzag tails. Well, this is very likely a reference to Isis and Kamush and the difficulty that Isis's other wives had in distinguishing between them. But the butterfly wife was able to accomplish this with the assistance of supernatural vision, symbolized here by the presence of lightning. Well, curiously, left of the spirit butterfly, we also have this large grid or net-like design. Well, this very likely represents the butterfly's medicine basket. In myth, medicine baskets are sometimes described as being painted red. Well, the artist may have carved this design over this red iron oxide stain just for that very purpose. So, taken in conjunction then with all of the story reference depicted here, the spirit butterfly and the basket design being the most prominent, it's not hard to see that this panel represents supernatural medicine. Now, one final consideration to keep in mind regarding rock art is its location. Now, as we've been told, Kamokamsh imbued the landscape with spiritual medicine. Much of this medicine appears in the form of rock art. Depending on location, this takes on many forms. Now, in the villages where people were concentrated over the winter, for example, shamans naturally kept their medicines handy because they needed to be able to call upon them at need. They would paint them on their support poles that upheld their lodges, on little boards they kept outside of their lodge. They also kept them as ornaments, which they wore or painted on their regalia. And they, of course, they always knew where to find rock art. But at the height of the gathering season, after the fish winds were over and after the locust harvest was past its peak, people would head for the uplands and then disperse into smaller family groups to harvest roots, tubers, seeds, and of course to hunt for large game. Now, during these times, the people were scattered well beyond the protective influence of the resident shamans. This meant that people in the uplands were highly susceptible to sicknesses caused by dangerous, malicious spirits.
To answer this need, shamans may have placed medicine all over the landscape for people to access at need. Medicine in the form of rock art, and they made every effort to make them easy to find.
This is one of many such sites. Now, there are several indicators here that places like this were intended to be used for spiritual health. First, these sites are located well away from villages, but still in places that people would go to in order to gather and hunt for various resources. Second, shamans made these symbols large and they clustered them close together, and they often as not painted them red and white to stand out against the natural surround. Well, this made them very noticeable to the people that shamans knew would be in these locations, and thus easy to find. And third, these sites are all made up of one of the strongest medicine symbols that shamans had at their disposal, the medicine disc of Kmokamsh. Thus, places like these were deeply infused with spiritual medicine. I can't imagine any other use for these sites. So, whether in the villages or in the mountains then, Kmokamsh made sure we had access to spiritual medicine.
Our creation stories are really our first proclamations of health. So many of them speak to the value of traditional medicines, the requirement for connection to land, the lessons that Mother Nature can provide. Traditional health encompassed all of these, and we wrap them with language, art, songs, dance, and relationships with one another.
Our ancestors passed these sacred narratives down to us with the hope that we would remember who we are and remain healthy and strong.
These stories are more than fanciful tales that pass cold, long winter nights. They are the heart of our people, providing knowledge of our origins, our values, our beliefs, and our understanding of spiritual medicine. It is thus our commitment to them and to our future to keep them alive. Without these sacred tales, it would not have been possible to explore the role rock art once played in our community.
Well, my earnest hope is to see the next generation make a similar documentary as the one we're doing here, except that they would have a greater understanding of the rock art and it would be narrated entirely in the Klamath language.
I believe that all things come in time, like the revival of this rock art and its meaning to our ancestors, a very deep reminder of how we once held the power to heal, how these sacred places continue to hold space for us. Our ancient people, our ancestors, they held on to these ways, a testament of how they owned their health. So many of our people are building connections to these places today, taking space in them, singing songs with them, praying amongst them. It is a true testament to the wellness journey that we're on, and a true testament to the health of our people.
Waklisi, no sasis, iwamlope. Hello, I'm Lahoma Sconchin, and I'm a Klamath, Modoc, and Paiute tribal member. My Pakisep is Linda Jimenez, and Patisep is the late Lynn Sconchin Sr. And I'm here to share with you about our medicine in the ground. My parents raised me and my sister and my brothers to know who we are, where we came from, And we were fortunate enough to know these places out on our homelands that you can go and be healed. Your spirit, your mind, your health. And one of the places that I come to is Grandma Butte and Grandma Rock. I was young when I came out here with my parents, and I seen my dad come up and talk to Grandma Rock. And being young, I seen it, but I didn't understand the significance at that time. And becoming a young adult, a teenager, and I was going through things in my life, struggles, and my dad told me I needed to come to Grandma Rock and release what was bothering me. And so it's been a practice of mine to come and share with her. And the way that I was taught was you approach her and you tap her on the shoulder, on her shoulder, and you talk with her. Just like you were talking, with somebody who you would confide in, somebody who would listen. And you would talk, you would cry. I've come out here and I've screamed and I've cried. And the teaching is that you leave it here with her. She takes those on. And that's what I do to vent, to release, and to move forward in a healthy way. And so I teach my children about these places so that they too, when they're struggling, they know they have a place to go to become grounded again, to release that. And when you come and you talk to her, you leave her something. Whatever you have. My dad said even the lint out of your pocket, you leave it if you don't have nothing else. So I always try and bring water with me when I come and visit her. You can give her food, tobacco, whatever you may have. And when you're done, you leave that stuff here. You don't take it with you. That's what she's for. You leave it here and you move on in your life in a healthy way. So I honor our people, our ancestors, my parents, my grandparents, when I come and I practice these ways and teach generations, to be respectful of these places, because they're here for a reason. They're here for us. They're here for our healing, our spirit, our connection. So I wanted to share that with you. So catcha.
I've always felt like Mount Shasta has had a pretty significant spiritual importance to our people. I've heard a lot of stories about it. Some of them I've even heard from different tribes. I was actually sick when I hiked up there. As I started going up, I was praying about things. It helped me to get my mind off my troubles. It really made me think about a lot of things. I had a lot of time to think about the choices that I was making, the trouble that I was having, It helped me to get out of the hustle and bustle that a normal day brings. It helped me think about the things that I was doing wrong, the things that I was doing right, the things that I needed to improve on. It felt so good to be up there that I wasn't even paying attention to the sickness that I was having in my stomach. I was up all night the night before with stomach aches. I couldn't keep nothing down, was kind of dehydrated. It helped me take my eyes off all of that. I was excited. I felt like I really was accomplishing something. I never experienced anything like it before. Here I was starting my hike in the middle of the night, hiking 12 hours one way. It took a lot out of me just to get up there, but I wasn't tired. I wasn't wore out. I wasn't feeling sick. After I got to the top and I started seeing things for what they were, I felt like I was somewhat empowered. Once I got done, I felt like I could do anything. In town, you get so caught up with everything that's going on around you that you don't really think about these things. You're not really grounded like you are up on the mountain.